Well, if you listen to the media narrative, if you listen to the liberal narrative, conservatives are just angry old white people, like, well, us two old angry white people.
Hey, speak for yourself.
Jason Kenney here with me, and Jason, you and I have talked about this before. The fact that you look through history, the history of Canada, so many firsts on the conservative side, and I always bring it up because my hometown has two of them: first female cabinet minister, first black MP.
Right.
But there's so many more, and just behind us, and this is why I said let's talk about this in Vancouver.
Right.
Just behind us is a building named for Douglas Young. Is it
Jung.
Douglas Jung, who I know his story, I just can't pronounce his name. So fill us in on Douglas Jung and then some of the other conservative firsts.
So Douglas Jung is an amazing story. He was born in Victoria, in Chinatown there in the 1920s. Victoria had one of the largest Chinatowns in North America, by the way, in the turn of the century period. And he was born into a Canada when Chinese were not considered full and equal citizens. Or even subjects of the crown. They did not have the right to vote, and they couldn't even use certain public facilities. In the Canada that Douglas Jung grew up in, he couldn't use a public swimming pool. There's some government buildings he couldn't go into. We don't know this, but there were specific municipal ordinances, provincial laws as well that basically were segregated.
It sounds like Jim Crow type laws.
More or less, they segregated Chinese people of Chinese ethnicity and origin in particular, and none of them could obtain citizenship or have the right to vote. So this is the Canada in which he grew up, and yet he was an incredibly proud Canadian. Mm-hmm. And that's what I find so wonderful about his story, that notwithstanding the adversity and the unjust discrimination that he faced, he still saw the greatness and potential for this country so much that when Canada entered the Second World War in 1939, and especially after the bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese in December of 1941, Douglas Jung gathered a group of young Canadian men of Chinese origin to march down to the Canadian Army Recruitment Center a couple of blocks from here to enlist to fight Japanese imperialism in the Second World War. And the Army said, "Go away. We don't want you guys. You're not welcome." And week after week after week, Doug Jung and his Chinese Canadian peers would show up, try to register. Finally, towards the end of the war, the Army, the Canadian military, realized it needed people with Chinese language skills because of the end of they were fighting in Manchuria, they were fighting in China, they needed special operators to go behind enemy lines. And so they enlisted a couple of hundred Chinese Canadians, including Doug Jung, who went behind enemy lines and helped to end the Second World War. That's 1945. He goes to law school, and in 1947, when Mackenzie King's government brought in the first Citizenship Act, Douglas Jung and the community managed to win full and equal citizenship for Canadians of Chinese origin, the right to vote, the right to serve. And then he became president of the Young Progressive Conservatives, the PCYF, the Progressive Conservative Youth Federation, and in 1957 ran as the Progressive Conservative candidate in Vancouver Centre, the riding where we are right now. He won the election then. He won again in 58. He served in the Diefenbaker government. He was the first member of Parliament of non-European origin, the first of Asian origin, the first of Chinese origin. He was a true trailblazer, a civil rights hero in the Canadian sense. And
his story needs to be told more.
Much more, which is why when there was a new Government of Canada building opening here in 2008, I believe, or 9, I worked very hard and succeeded in having it named the Douglas Jung Building. It's one of my proudest achievements.
And you've had many achievements as Minister of Everything over the years.
And this is you might say, what's a small symbolic thing, but symbols matter. They really matter because, as I said, when we opened this building and named it after him, the Douglas Jung, when he was a young man, could not go into certain public buildings, and now a Government of Canada building is named after him.
That is fantastic. So Ellen Fairclough building in Hamilton, first female cabinet minister and a conservative.
So he also worked with Ellen Fairclough in the Conservative caucus of John Diefenbaker.
So, I mean, those are two big firsts in one government.
And exactly. And he worked with her to bring about a form of redress for the Chinese Canadians who had suffered real discrimination under the immigration law, the so-called head tax, and then the Exclusion Act. Now, by the way, I have to tell you this, Brian. Why was Douglas Jung a conservative? Because he remembered that it was Laurier who increased by 800% the head tax, because the old head tax of 1885 was inadequate in achieving the unjust objective of keeping Chinese from immigrating. So Wilfrid Laurier, one of the icons of a great prime minister, I don't want to besmirch him, but you will never hear a Liberal acknowledge that he massively increased the Chinese head tax to exclude Asian immigration to Canada. And then in 1923, Mackenzie King adopted the Exclusion Act that said even if you can afford the head tax and you're Chinese, you cannot immigrate. Now this meant that there were tens of thousands of Chinese young men, they were called Chinese bachelors, living in these rooming houses in Chinatown. So all those old buildings were, and their sweethearts, their wives, their children were back in China. And because of the 1923 Liberal Exclusion Act, they could not immigrate to Canada. So
when did that change?
1947, with the repeal of the Exclusion Act. But in 1958, Doug Jung worked with Ellen Fairclough, your Hamilton first woman cabinet minister, to allow every person of Chinese descent in Canada to sponsor a relative, typically a wife, from China to try to make up for that catastrophe that separated families.
Let's talk about some of the other conservative firsts. First Muslim MP in Canada. First Muslim elected to Parliament was one of your old caucus buddies.
Raheem Jaffer, and the first Hindu, Deepak Oberoi. The second Hindu was Devinder Shori, conservative. The first black Canadian MP and minister was your fellow Hamiltonian, the Honourable Lincoln Alexander, who was also the first black viceroy in Canada, appointed by Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, the first Canadian of Japanese origin elected to Parliament, and as a minister was Conservative Bev Oda. The first Canadian of Eastern European origin to sit in the federal cabinet was Michael Starr, a.k.a. Michael Starkovich, from Oshawa in the Diefenbaker cabinet. The first person of Korean origin in the Parliament of Canada is Deputy Conservative Senate Leader Yana Martin. The first the first Sunni Muslim in the Parliament of Canada was actually Salma Atulajan in the Senate, and on and on and on. The story goes, but the Conservative Party, contrary to official wisdom, has actually been the party of diversity and breakthroughs in so many ways.
And doing it, I would say for the most part, without trying to curry special favors or any of that. It's just that people join because they say, here's principles that I believe in.
This is true, although Doug Jung said that he became a conservative in part because of the liberal history of racism and immigration policy, the Exclusion Act and so forth. So people need to understand. I mean, John Diefenbaker was the first prime minister of neither English nor French origin, which in its own time, I mean, you would say, oh, he was a descendant of German immigrants. What is that? Well, in those days, it was a big deal.
It was 1958.
Right.
The war had ended only 14 years earlier. Yes. I mean, Diefenbaker's family had been in Canada a long time, but
he was not pure laine, French-Canadian or British background. He was what he called from the third wave, from the other people of other backgrounds. He appointed a guy named Paul Yuzik, son of Ukrainian pioneers, to the Senate of Canada, who responded to Lester Pearson's bilingualism and biculturalism commission by saying, what about the rest of us who are neither British nor French origin? We respect those founding nations. We respect the institutions, traditions, and language that they represent. But we need to include everybody. And that was the history of the Conservative Party.
All right, Jason Kenney, thanks so much.
Thanks, Brian.
Thanks for watching. Click here to never miss a Rebel update. Want even more of the Rebel? Well, click here to become a premium member.